Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of In the Eyes of Truth. Back with us is my brother by another mother. It's Cameron MacGregor from the clan
Chaz,
MacGregor.
every time we're on, you get all polished up for me. You got a nice haircut, you're on vacation, you're in a good
Ooh.
mood.
And you've
I should
got
be
the
so special. I should be so special.
and you've got the devil's advocate background.
Yeah, how did you guess? That's exactly what I'm going for.
When is it going to start turning into screaming angels?
If you look carefully, if you look very closely, you can see it already is, Chaz.
Well, those angels are screaming. They got a little angel. Well, if you want to call him that, who went to it probably wasn't heaven. I can't say. It's not my place to say at the end of the day, but I'm guessing it probably wasn't. The Graham ceremonies. Yeah. The perv went back to the site of his big crime network one last time.
How did that news greet you? Because I have to say, I'm not all that far from the DC area. I'm sort of just on the outskirts. It didn't really make many waves here. I mean, it was covered. People talked about it for a minute, but not much was said. What about in your
Hello, dear friends. Just want to remind you if you like this video, you like what you hear, click like, subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. Send it to your friends. Let's grow this channel. Maybe we can finally hit it up to 100,000. That'd be a good round number for the summer. So let me know, leave some comments, and give a thumbs up. So look forward to seeing you in the next video. Cheers.
neck of the woods?
Nah, that's about it. It blip on the radar. Actually, I was on X and it just popped up one time, and I'm like, oh yeah, I guess they are very. Yeah, it was the picture of them carrying him back into Capitol Hill. So
Yeah,
he went back one last time to scene of his crime.
yeah. Well, you know what's sad about the whole thing is that Lindsey Graham, for obvious reasons we don't have to relitigate, never saw a country he didn't want to invade or a war he didn't want to start, things of that nature. But what's sad is that over the course of his life, his views have won in Washington.
Yeah,
His views have won. Virtually the entire establishment, doesn't matter whether they're Democrats, Republicans, doesn't matter if they're lobbyists or they're foreign policy officials, they agree with him. And
yeah.
I was looking at this list. I don't know if you've seen this. The list of countries since January of 2024, when Trump became president, that we have either struck directly or indirectly. Yemen, Iran, Syria, Iraq, Somalia, Nigeria, Venezuela, some operations in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and blockading Cuba indirectly.
Wait,
So
what about
all
Russia?
this, all yeah, and I didn't even include that. So obviously you could include that. All this from the anti-war candidate. I shudder to think what we'll get when the official war candidate is elected. But what is that if not a testament to the fact that Lindsey Graham, ultimately, he was victorious. His views have prevailed.
I, you know, with the indirectly, I'll add a few more countries to you. Burkina Faso,
Hmm.
Mali, Niger.
Hmm. Yep.
But there's another one
Yep.
that's between them, because there's four of them. And they're all under attack and yeah, well, Syria, you mentioned Syria. They're all
Yeah.
under attack by US, France, and Ukrainian Nazis who are
Yeah.
training the Islamic jihadists.
Yeah. I mean, it's truly incredible. And here's what's really disconcerting about the whole thing. And I have to say, I think you go on the Duran, don't you, every now
Oh
and
yeah,
again?
yeah.
Yeah, and it's a great program, and I try to consume as much of their content as I can. I particularly like Mercurious's content,
Hmm.
but I have to tell you that when I watch their commentary about the United States, it's just flat wrong. It really is. Not the details, you understand, but there is this sort of context that they like to add regarding what's happening in Washington, D.C. And I have to say, I experienced the same thing in Moscow. I vaguely remember hearing similar things when I was in China back in 2019. And that is that they think there's some kind of strategic calculus going on in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah.
They talk routinely, and every time that you and I have had a conversation, these issues are discussed in some detail. Munition shortages, overextension of the U.S. military. Now we have an energy crisis in the United States. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. We are running dangerously low in the strategic reserves. Our refinery capacity is at 95% utilization. All of these things, these safeguards. And yet, month after month, quarter after quarter, and year after year, we continue to run the empire hot. And there is, no matter what is thought by folks in China or Russia or the Middle East, by the way, I see evidence of this from the Iranians too. None of the details of exactly how these wars have been prosecuted, the limitations of U.S. military power, the harm to U.S. service members. I mean, for God's sakes, 40% of the U.S. submarine fleet is essentially grounded because we don't have the maintenance facilities to deploy these assets. Kind of important if you're trying to fight a global war or global conflicts, which we are. None of that whatsoever has factored in to the analysis coming out of the Pentagon or Langley or in the White House or among certainly not the Israelis that are countenancing or advising the president. And to make it all worse, there is not a single scalable political organization or movement or party of note in the United States that opposes any of this. Sure, Americans don't support the war. That's true. But they care more about their gas prices.
Right.
And because the president's friends in the White House and the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent have been able to manipulate oil prices via arbitrage in the paper markets, and oil has been gyrated up and down, even though the physical supply demand curve has absolutely nothing to do with crude oil at $80 a barrel. We know that for obvious reasons. Most Americans, they don't much care. That's the truth. That is the fact of the
Yeah.
matter. And I say all of that to say this. Their assertion, they meaning the Duran and others, is that there are strategic safeguards that are holding back the President of the United States or the U.S. military such that it does not extend these wars or embroil us in more or worse. And I'm sorry, Shaz, that's just not the case. In other words, the train has left the station and nobody is in the engine room that's going to stop it. Nobody.
Yeah. There's two things here. I agree with you, but there is a note that there is an overarching plan, or maybe not a plan, a goal. Goal is world hegemony. That never went away. And they tried running different little plans. But you're right. Most of these plans have absolutely zero grounding. Some have a little bit of grounding in reality, but they're not really, well, they're plans, I think more, they're not even maybe plans, they're more like concepts. Let's go do this. Let's go do that for the end goal of world hegemony. But they're not really planned. Ukraine is a prime example. Iran is a prime example. The goal is we're going to control the oil. We're going to control the choke points. We're going to be the hegemon. And it's going to take us 3 days to overthrow Iran. And yeah, you're right. When that doesn't happen, and then what happens? They have no idea what to
You
do.
know, here's a different way to look at it because I certainly understand that point of view and I hear a lot of it on Twitter and beyond. And I do think that there is some evidence to support what you're saying. However, I think a better way to characterize it is that essentially who's gotten control of the American machinery of government or governance to include the military industrial complex, the foreign policy establishment, and I would include the Fortune 500 companies in the United States, are a bunch of arsonists that are burning down not just the U.S. military empire in the Middle East and beyond, but they burn down the American economy as well. And they've done so to such a great extent, so existentially, that what's remarkable about it more than anything else is that because they have essentially rendered the patient numb, or they've benumbed the American consumer with cheap energy and cheap credit, the patient, the host, that is not just the United States population, but the West in general, that we are too sort of drugged out. We have too much dopamine in our system to realize what is really happening. And I say that with two examples. Steve Eisman, I don't know if you know who he is, but Steve Eisman was played by Steve Carell in the movie The Big Short.
Hmm.
Okay. So Steve Eisman is a famed investor, largely acquired fame, not just from the movie, but because he shorted the mortgage-backed security catastrophe in the lead up to 2008, among others, like Michael Burry. And he was interviewed not less than a few days ago on CNBC, asked about the stock market, but importantly, asked about the energy situation that we face, which I regard, and I'm sure you would concur, as a crisis, not just in the
Oh yeah.
United States, but around the world. A crisis that we have started because of this disastrous war in the Middle East, which is only getting worse. More on that in just a moment. But Steve Eisman says, when he's asked, do you think oil prices are a concern? Do you think a drainage in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is a concern? He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, I think there's an oil glut. China was able to essentially defray 3 million barrels in consumption a day for the last
Oh.
few months. Therefore, we have a glut, and it's really not something to worry about. Then he's asked, and this is important too. He's asked, well, what about inflation? He said, well, I'm not too concerned about inflation because if there is a reflash of inflation, which could happen, oh, I don't know, because of oil prices, because of refined products, because of a sort of structural inflation created by all the money printing that hasn't really gone away or dissipated, as you know. Well, we'll just raise interest rates and those inflationary pressures will abate in quick fashion. Why do I say that? Because Steve Eisman is a Wall Streeter. And that thinking, Stas, is what is predominant in Washington, D.C. At
Yep.
the same time, I just saw an interview, and I think this is equally noteworthy, of the CEO of the American Petroleum Institute. The guy's name is Mike Summers. And Mike Summers says, we're in a dangerous situation. We have drained the reserves such that they're lower today than they've been since the 1980s. And of course, we didn't create the reserves, what, until the 70s as it is. Um, but even though that's the case, we can't allow Iran to have the straits. Can't permit it. So you see the conundrum that we're in here is that the entire intelligentsia in the United States, and this is my response to what the Duran has said, the entire intelligentsia in the United States, to include Silicon Valley, Wall Street, as I said, the foreign policy establishment, all of the various think tanks, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. Have you heard of that one?
Oh, of
That's where the
course.
blockade, that's where the blockade came from. All of these epicenters of what you might call the American Brain Trust are brain dead. And that is why the safeguards, whether it's the strategic limitations of the US military or the energy complex, they're gone. And that is why this war is resuming. It's going to get a lot worse. And ultimately, the only way that Iran is going to prevail, and I'm sad to say the only way the Russians are going to prevail in this conflict, which is getting worse, is to win on the battlefield. That's it. And for the Iranians, what that means is two things. It means that they're going to have to offensively destroy whatever's left of the U.S. military empire and infrastructure in the Middle East. They're going to have to literally push us out, and they're going to have to neuter or neutralize or defang the Israeli state. How exactly or what exactly that looks like, I don't know. But I do know that short of those two objectives, that region of the world, the Middle East, and all the downstream consequences, it cannot return to peace and stability, period. That's where we are.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And, people would rather consider their rule by evil geniuses than moronic fools.
You know that two other points here, and again, I know I'm preaching to the choir a bit, but I do think it's important for your audience in particular to process it because I often think when I come on your program in particular, what is the unique insight that I have? Because if we're talking about battle damage assessment, you have more insight into that than I do. What about the refinery capacity or the damage to Russian refinery capacity? Well, you have more insight into that than I do. Certainly, you have other guests that are going to be able to tell you about the machinations of Iranian politics better than I do. Yeah, I was a naval officer, but that was a long time ago. I am privy to the limitations of the U.S. military. We talked about that just a moment ago. But no, my insight is as follows. I know how people in Washington, D.C., and New York City, where I just was a few weeks ago, I know extremely well what they think and what they don't think. And this is what's absolutely scary. At least this keeps me up at night. In the lead up to the special military operation in 2022, which we all remember quite well, I was in DC. And Putin, who had given several speeches and issued several warnings before that invasion or that military action, however you want to characterize it, occurred, those warnings were ignored. And people in DC said the following: the Russians, they'll never go into Ukraine because they're afraid of being sanctioned or tariffed by the West. Okay. So then the Russians do go into Ukraine, and people in DC say, yeah, but this is a short-term operation because the Russian economy is essentially Gazprom and the Russian military is essentially a bunch of nukes. It's Gazprom with nukes. That's all the Russian Federation is. They don't have the metal, the capacity to sustain operations, and the sanctions will kill them. And furthermore, the rest of the world, the global south included, will isolate Russia. Now, of course, we know that none of those things happened whatsoever. In
Yep.
fact, it was quite the opposite. And we know that there have been millions of casualties, that the state of Ukraine essentially has been destroyed. It's been a very serious war, and the Russians are winning it. But here's what's crazy, all right? Here's what's very disturbing. We're here 2026. We've watched this conflict get worse year after year after year. And do you know what people in DC think, Shaz?
They're winning.
They think the Russians are bogged down.
Yep.
They think that Putin could lose power at any moment. They think that essentially Ukraine is poised to reorganize itself and with drone technology can actually turn the front in our favor. And by the way, when I say people think this, I'm talking about historians like Niall Ferguson, who is British but now lives in the United States and he's part of the American establishment. He's not a buffoon, okay? He is part of the intelligentsia inside of the United States. Now, we've been at war with Iran for 5 months. We
Hmm.
have done tremendous damage to the global economy. I think that it's fair to say the Middle East is now in a regional war. The Houthis are now fighting against Saudi Arabia. God knows that that was a war the Saudis didn't want to fight. I think they're now involved in it. I think every major power, more or less, is basically in this conflict, with the potential exception of the Turks. And I think they're going to be embroiled too when the Israelis and folks in the government finally involve the Kurds, which I think they will in some kind of effort to attack Iran. That means eventually they'll be pulled in as well. Our bases have been destroyed, or at least structurally damaged beyond repair across the region. And what do people in DC think? Just as in the case of Russia and the special military operations since 2022, 4 years, they have learned nothing. They think that we can use ground troops or one massive blitzkrieg from the air, and eventually we'll get back control of the straits and we'll rebalance our empire in the region like as if nothing happened. This is what these people actually believe. And the fall elections that a lot of people think is another safeguard that has absolutely no bearing on it. And here's your proof. Thomas Massey was just voted out, as you probably know, I think the
Oh,
fourth
of course,
district
of
in
course.
Kentucky, because AIPAC and other Confederates, the American Israeli Council, spent $37 million, a record in a congressional race, to remove the only sober-minded, sane person in the Republican Party that firmly opposed AIPAC and a widening of the Iran war. So while Congress, or at least the House, passes a non-binding legal resolution saying we want to end the war, which doesn't send anything to Donald Trump to sign, which in no way, shape, or form controls money or limits the money to finance operations in the Middle East, absolutely nobody on the Hill will do anything meaningful to stop a widening the conflict in the Middle East, regardless of who is elected this fall. That is how dangerous this situation is. All the meanwhile, the Russians, the Iranians, and to a lesser extent the Chinese are telling us and continue to say, if you keep going like this, there will be dire consequences for you and potentially for the global economy. Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
Yep. Well, now Ukraine has struck Iranian ships in the Caspian, which they couldn't have done without American
Of course.
satellite info.
Of course not.
Iran's going to strike if they haven't already launched. They're going to strike into Ukraine. Now, Iran has three options. One, they can fire themselves directly out of Iran, but they got more limited range, and it's only their top line missiles. Two, they can ask to fire off of Russia's territories to get closer. I don't think that'd be a problem. And three, if they're now, Iran has 1 million men under arms. They can up that to 3 million men. But the problem is they don't have combat experience. I mean, if we're going to be honest, the vast majority of them do not have combat experience, especially on a modern battlefield. Not hit and run, like the militias doing in Iraq. So that they just don't because that generation that fought are in their early 50s to mid 60s. And 18, 19, 20, 30 year olds, they don't have any experience.
Yeah.
And then there's Russia. And
Yeah.
Ukraine has basically declared war on Iran. And Iran could easily send 100,000 troops up north to get combat experience. At least those that survive would get
Yeah.
combat experience and come back south. And what are you going to do? And since they're not, you know, the North Koreans were used only in Kursk, Oblast. That's it. But the Iranians would be at war with Ukraine directly, and they'd just go anywhere.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and then when you add in the Sakal, you've got a basically a front that's more or less it's consolidating and it's already on three continents.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why I call attention to the Duran because it's look, it's an excellent program and the facts and figures are right. But the phenomenology, the understanding of exactly what's going on here, it's just not it's not well understood. And by the way, Shaz, it's not well understood by the population. The
Yeah.
population, the average American thinks, yeah, maybe we're draining the reserves, but the elites, the technocrats, however dangerous they may be, they're safeguards. They will make sure that the structural integrity of those salt mines are maintained. They'll make sure that the refineries which are running hot, well, there won't be industrial accidents. They'll make sure there's gas in my tank and there's money in the bank. And unfortunately, as we both discussed, that simply is not the case. And then, of course, on a parallel channel, you have, I think, destruction, and I think you saw my Substack about this. You
Hmm.
have a very serious problem in the monetary system. And my sense is that we're about to experience something like what happened in the early stages of World War One, in which the London Stock Exchange closed for 5 months because by July of 1914, there was a money market liquidity crisis across the European continent and the world, frankly, and a liquidity crisis in 50 countries because of the beginning of World War One.
Yep.
Finally, in July of 1914 is when markets woke up, not when Franz Ferdinand was assassinated the month before, not in the sort of skirmishes in the previous Balkans conflicts, but finally at the end, when the ultimatum was served to Serbia by Austria, that's when the markets finally figured it out. And my point is that the markets in the United States, I mean, as I said, I was just in New York City. Wall Street thinks what's going on in the Middle East, and by the way, the population in the United States thinks the same thing. This is just another Middle Eastern war. It's
Yep.
just another quagmire. It doesn't matter. It doesn't affect us. We really don't care. What does it matter if you obliterate another sort of backward, decadent, or degraded Middle Eastern country? Nobody cares. And so the assumption is, yeah, maybe there are cracks in the financial system, the shadow banks, they're having issues with redemptions. They're borrowing money from the banks against their assets under management to actually provide liquidity for some of their depositors. Yeah, the housing market, it's a bit wobbly, interest rates keep going up. But at the end of the day, energy crisis notwithstanding, wars multiplying everywhere. Hey, AI is going to fix it all, and we're in a
Yeah,
bull
yeah.
market. That's what they actually believe. And the
Yeah.
reason I'm saying all of this is because if you understand or accept the premise of what I'm saying, that no lessons have been learned, that there is no responsible statecraft going on, it means that eventually the Russians, the Iranians, the Chinese, and others are going to figure that out. I don't
All
think
right.
they figured it out yet. I could be wrong, Stas. You're closer to Moscow than I am. But eventually they're going to figure out that we are an irrational actor completely. And then I fear for what is to come.
I think they figured out that the U.S. is irrational, but I don't think they quite figured out how much lack of planning. On Russian television, it's still coming from at least from the Kremlin. There's still demands that Trump not be criticized because we may still be able to talk to him. Like, but to whom? Talk to which version of Trump?
Yeah.
I mean, what day of the week is it? Which version are we on right now?
Yeah. Well, the thing about it too is that as bad as Donald Trump is, and let's call it what it is, and I've thought this for 10 years, you and I talked about it when I was in
Hmm.
Russia. Donald Trump was never qualified to be president.
Oh, of course not.
Set aside what you think of his policies, and I agreed with many of his policies, and I still do. What he verbalized in 2016, end the wars overseas, pull forces out of Iraq and Afghanistan, get out of Syria. These are all things, as you recall, he said. Remember, he said that Bush's decision to invade Iraq was one of the cataclysmically stupid decisions ever made by an American president. Yeah,
Yep.
absolutely. And of course, we know the other side. He also talked about closing the borders. He talked about resetting American trade relationships, getting control of our deficits, all of these things. So I agreed in principle with all of that. But the entire Capitol Hill community, both parties, a lot of the infrastructure I talked about a moment ago, the K Street lobbyists, these nonprofits and so forth, that's the permanent government that never changes hands regardless of who is elected. And so, whatever Trump's faults may be, he was never going to overturn that. And here's what's worse, and this is something I just don't think a lot of people understand, is that for the President of the United States to de-escalate these conflicts such that you can get something like a sustainable peace agreement, whether you're talking about in Ukraine or you're talking about in the Middle East or beyond, maybe in East Asia, you have to have an executive that has the capacity to actually implement those kinds of structural changes. Getting out of this war in Iran, Wall Street thinks he can just send out a tweet and say, hey, it's over. We've won. No, he's got to get our forces out. He's got to disassemble our bases. He's got to get our equipment out. He's got to sort of sever ties with the Israelis. These are complex issues. And so the end result, and this is, I suppose, my final point to Duran, if they're watching and others, is that how do these wars end? Well, in Western Europe, it means the dissolution of NATO. Nothing less than that. NATO must be dissolved. Probably the European Union is gone too, and they're working overtime to make that one happen because of the euro and its incongruities and so forth. And then in the Middle East, as I said a moment ago, American boots must exit. Period. There must be a
Yep.
mass
Yep.
exodus. Nothing less than that is going to end these conflicts.
So in other words, they're going to do all the opposite, the exact opposite of what you just mentioned.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Which means that these wars are going to get worse.
Yep.
And my hope is, and this is what I said in the Substack essay, and if I'm wrong on this particular point, frankly, you should all hope that I'm right. But if I'm wrong, then you're going to get a kind of war that I don't think anybody wants, certainly not the global South. But that is to say, I think it's a monetary mushroom cloud that's going to finally derail the West. I really do. I think we're very close to that. But if we don't get that, it's going to be a major, massive military defeat that we just can't conceal anymore, particularly in the Middle East. That's what it'll take because there will be no political relief valve. It's not there. It's gone. And the same is true, albeit I think it's even worse in Western Europe. There's absolutely no relief there to be had politically either. They're going to double down, double down, and double down.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. Um, Not that I don't have a lot of weapon systems to double down with. I mean, they're hitting rock bottom at this point for most weapon systems. Well, let me ask you this. You know, What do you think is going to happen with the Israelis? There's a lot of people saying they're on the edge. Then Yahoo comes out. We're gonna, pull in 200,000 reservists. The 300,000 they called up, they only got about 200,000. So one third either was already gone or just refused to show up. He hasn't gotten more popular. Okay, granted, most of his opposition is more psychotic than him. That's saying something. But they're going to pull another 200,000 people from their crashing economy.
I think what we're witnessing, as I mentioned a moment ago, with the structural changes in Western Europe, the dissolution of NATO, the end of the European Union, and I recognize that what I'm describing, these are very big things
Yeah,
that a lot of people in the West, Shaz, and you know this better than I do, they can't imagine it. It's like impossible to imagine these things. I think they're not only are they going to happen, but they're quite imminent. I think this is the end of the state of Israel. I really do. I do not see how they're going to survive this. It's not simply because I would add that this war has gone so terribly for them. And when I say war, it's really wars. I mean, essentially what the Israelis have done, and I think this is the strategy that we're deploying against Iran as well, and the Russians, is the Yinon plan. I don't know if you ever heard of the Yinon plan, but Oded Yinon was an advisor to Ariel Sharon, wrote this document in 1982, in which essentially he said, in order to make the Greater Israel Project happen, from essentially the Nile River Valley to the Euphrates River, we're going to have to fragment, balkanize the entire Arab world, essentially chop them up into these internecine patches of population, and then we're going to colonize. We're going to build human settlements over top of it. Now, when it comes to Iran or Russia, there's no interest in human settlement, but we'll turn them into economic organ donors for the West, which is
right.
sort of what Russia was in the 1990s, as you well know. So it's the same strategy. It's just a slightly different result. No settlements, no real colonization in that sense, but it's financial harvesting. And that's what BlackRock and the rest of these major companies, as you know, that's what they want. That's why they think the Chinese are an enemy too, because the Chinese won't let international capital come into Beijing or Shanghai so that they can take over the country as well. And they all thought that when China entered the WTO in 1999, essentially that would happen. And so that plan, the Yinon plan, is going to go until it can't go. And in the lead up to 2026, I would say really from October of 2023 until this disastrous war with Iran started, the Israelis lost, I would say, really the only moderates, the sort of core capable Israelis. Sometimes they're called liberal Zionists, that type of thing. They're gone. They're living in Cyprus. Maybe they're in Argentina. Some of them have come back to the United States, that sort of thing. So all that's left are the hardcore militant Zionists that you speak of, and they will not permit this war to end. And furthermore, Shaz, they won't permit the United States to decouple either. And nobody's going to force that decoupling because there is no political organization of scale that can challenge these people. As I mentioned a moment ago, you challenge AIPAC, you challenge Miriam Adelson, you challenge Benjamin Netanyahu's control over Capitol Hill, we will throw $40 million at you and you're done. You're silenced. And it doesn't matter what the polls say. Again, that safeguard, the notion that the president has to justify what he's doing is absurd. I just read the list of all the wars that we're fighting. MAGA is still there. It's only symbolic. It's not a real movement. We know that. But where's the insurrection? Where's the upheaval? It's not there. So the answer to your question is this is probably the dissolution of the Israeli state. And my guess is it's going to come, and this might be a unique take on this platform, but I think it's going to come when, for all intents and purposes, the entire Islamic world comes down on them. I think what has happened with Iran is they have become sort of the leaders of the House of Islam. And I think eventually the entire region is going to come behind or under their banner, which you do not hear in the West. Nobody
No,
would say
no, no.
such a thing. But that is what's going to happen. And I think that the Turks are also going to switch sides. I think that they eventually will come under the banner. Maybe that's the wrong word, alongside, opportunistically or otherwise, because they conclude correctly, by the way, that the American empire and the Israeli sponsor state, or vice versa, it's intolerable. There can be no peace, no balance of power, no real economy, nothing until those axes are utterly destroyed. And that's what's going to happen.
Well, right now you've got, we had the meeting between Rubio and Lavrov,
Yep.
which 35 minutes, some
Yes.
harsh words. At
Yep.
the end, they'd make a semi-rosy speech, and bombing begins again by Ukrainian drones, mostly against civilian targets, people sleeping in their homes at night. And now you've got Trump and Rubio, those two shysters, are trying to push Putin into signing a ceasefire, an aviation ceasefire. So where Russia is absolutely 99% dominant, they want a ceasefire.
Yep.
Do they honestly believe Russia would just give up that massive an advantage for
Look,
what? What gain?
I just read an article, I can't recall the exact outlet, in which it argued that Iran is sabotaging the peace process in the
Oh,
Middle
yeah, I
East.
saw that.
Yeah. Now, look, um, Stas, if I come to your house, I murder your whole family except you. I don't relinquish further threats. I still have sufficient armament and weaponry to kill you and whomever else. Are you going to come to a peace agreement with that person? Are you going to set aside the collateral damage that has been done to you and your house so that you can come to some kind of an agreement? This is the insanity of the people that we're dealing with. But, one thing here that's very important to note is that Americans, to be fair to us, because I am hard on my own people, as you know, especially the elites. And here I'm not talking about the Zionists per se. I'm really talking about the Tucker Carlsons of the world, okay? Is that we have a lot of distance between the result of our foreign policy blunders in particular and its impact on our lives. I mean, you're talking thousands and thousands of miles away. It doesn't absolve us of the responsibility from what we have permitted, but the truth of it, the truth of the matter is that Trump has a UFC match at the White House, and then he goes back and has his little negotiations with Russia. We're far removed from the visceral consequences. It is, as you said before we got on the program, these people are LARPing.
Yep,
They're not real statesmen. They're not real leaders. They have no concept of a war zone. Part of the reason when I was in Russia with you, you said, "Hey, would you like to go down to the Donbass?" I said, "Absolutely." Because I knew that the only way I was going to have a chance at gaining a real understanding of the consequences of what's happening is to go down there. You think anybody on
absolutely.
the Hill gives a shit about any of that? Do you think they have a clue what's going on? I mean, Howard Lutnick, when he came to Washington, D.C. to be part of the Trump administration, he bought a $25 million mansion from Brett Baer, who's an anchor at Fox News. Do you think that somebody at that level of wealth has any concept that 50, 60, 70% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck? They don't. Never
Oh, no.
mind some war across the world in which your sort of infantile version of reality is, well, we're Team America, we're good, even if we blow up the pyramids. If you haven't seen the movie, you should see it.
Team
Uh,
America, hell
it's
yes.
it's not our fault. We have good intentions, and by contrast, whether you do something good or bad as a Russian, it doesn't matter because you're playing for the bad team.
Yep.
That sort of bi that sort of bimodal paradigm, that's what continues to dominate the psyche of the American elites, intelligentsia, even I would say mainstream culture. And we have got to move beyond that if we're prepared to actually hold negotiations with the Russians and so forth. But the reality is, and you know this better than I do, Putin, and I understand his point of view, he doesn't want war with us. The Chinese don't want war with us. Iran doesn't want war with us. I could go on and on and on. But unfortunately, they better start dealing with the rogue state as a rogue state. And
Yep.
I think that's what's about to happen.
Yeah, yeah. By the way, you got to understand, Lotnick had to move down because his next door, to Epstein's mansion. It's just got the wrong vibes these days. The kitty market's dried up. Meanwhile, in Washington, the kitty market's at full blossom.
I don't know whether to laugh or cry. But again, what I just cannot emphasize enough is that the damage that's been done by all of these people. Uh, I mean, four, I think, of the five wealthiest counties in the United States are sitting within an hour radius by driving by car
Hmm.
of where I am right now. And then you go to Wall Street and you're talking about levels of wealth that are hard to process, and the rest of the population and the rest of the world is living in squalor in some sense because
Oh
of
yeah.
their recklessness, and they've never been held to account. So, Shaz, I mean, why would these people think that having destroyed Ukraine, which they've done, they would ever be held accountable for it? Why would
No,
they
of course
think
not.
that the collateral damage to Qatar Energy or Saudi Aramco, which recently came under attack? I mean, none of these people have ever really felt any skin in the game. And what do we know about Donald Trump right now, in particular, just as an example? He's getting rich.
Oh yeah.
He's getting filthy rich and richer by the month by virtue of being president.
And that's coming from a man that was already a billionaire. Coming from a man that made 30 billion off of his pump and dump scheme of Trump coins, which are now 97 plus percent off peak. And how many
And
people bought into that? And usually it's poor people that don't have that much disposable income at all.
how many senior leaders inside the Pentagon, maybe ex-CIA, have gotten rich doing the same thing and have their little McMansions on the Potomac? This is the issue. This is why, Axios put out a report. I'm sure you saw it, arguing or indicating that Bradley Cooper, the CENTCOM commander, told the president, "Hey, you need to come to a halt because his military air campaigns, they can't work," or so forth and so forth. And we've heard similar stories about the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, this guy raising Cain, and yet it doesn't stop. Nothing stops. And
No?
the reason is because the institutional safeguards, they're gone. And the
Yeah.
people that are at those levels, as you know, you were the military, you know exactly how it works. You don't get into that position of authority if you tell the truth.
Oh,
If
of
if
course.
Bradley Cooper told the president what is reported in Axios, I don't think he would be CENTCOM commander much longer. But a lot of people think
Hmm.
that that's how it actually works. When in fact, if you know your history, and here I'm referencing Vietnam in particular, what you get from senior leaders in the government and the military is a dereliction of duty. That's what H.R. McMaster's book was all about in
Yep.
the 1970s or 60s and 70s. It was a failure of the brass, not just of the government. And you could pin potentially even more blame inside the Pentagon than in the White House National Security Council. And so this sort of institutional rot and decay, it's just not appreciated outside of the United States and maybe outside of the West.
Yeah. You are absolutely right. You are absolutely right. And I mean, look at the candidates that are pushing up for the next presidential elections. You know, I mean, Hillary Clinton's name is back in the running. For God's sakes, you got the geriatric ward, and not just for the age group, but they're all sick. They either have dementia,
Yeah,
schizophrenia,
yeah,
whatever that hyena laughing syndrome that Hillary Clinton has, where she loses control over herself and just starts laughing, hackling like a hyena. But
yeah,
they're all sick people,
yeah,
and mentally sick also.
yeah. No, I mean, look, we have reached entropy in
Yeah.
the West. There's absolutely no question about it. And because of that, these conflicts are going to get worse. And as I have said repeatedly now in your program, the safeguards, they're gone. I think what will help tremendously is if we hit tank bottoms, if interest rates continue to soar, and I think they will, if the Chinese do in fact have a lot more gold than they say they do, and we have a lot less, those things are going to help. But I fail to see how any negotiated settlement is going to resolve the conflicts in Ukraine, or in the Middle East. I think we're in for, call it a final kinetic phase, a sort of battle of annihilation. I don't necessarily think it's World War III. I don't subscribe to that, in part because I don't see evidence that the global South, that the Russians, the Chinese want anything to do with that. But we continue to push.
Well, whether or not you want anything to do with it, the other side wants to come to your house, dig up your lawn, break your door in, rape your wife and your kids. You don't have a choice at that point, whether you want to stay out of this war or not. You're now a combatant.
Yeah, and obviously in this regard, my main concern is I shouldn't say obviously, but my main concern is a potential nuclear exchange in the Middle East, courtesy of our dear friends in Israel, because I do
Yeah.
think the Samson option is quite real. And in the past, it's always been the United States government, military, that has put the shackles on those folks to prevent them from going the distance. Who's going to do that today? Who's going to do it? I don't see it. I just don't see it. And that's what really scares me. And potentially the Iranians know that as well. And maybe that's why their escalations have been as surgical as they have been. But at the end of the day, they're dealing with a madman. They're
Yeah.
dealing with a power that is rogue, and dealing with that, uh, that's precarious, you know?
Well, you said it I'm trying to come up with an argument that maybe play the devil's advocate, but the problem is I can't. You're right. And what we see is absolutely the machine is just spitting up carbon copy of crap candidates, and everything's in there is to keep going. Just keep going.
Yeah.
But
I
you
think
think
we just,
they're gonna launch a ground invasions?
yeah, I do.
What a
And you remember
disaster.
we chatted about this,
Yeah, yeah.
and you said, what did you ask me? You said, yeah, with what? How? Where are they going to land? What are they going to do? And in this regard, as one service member to another, we used to talk about the make sensometer. I don't know if you remember
Hmm.
this. When I was in the Navy, it was a big deal. And we said the higher on the make sensometer it is, the less likely it is to happen. Does it make sense in
None,
any way, shape,
none,
or form
none.
to launch
Zero.
ground forces?
Zero.
We don't really have them to send. We are fighting a war that's completely changed. I mean, for Christ's sakes, in the New York Times article that I think was actually pretty good, and Max Blumenthal, who I have the utmost respect for as a journalist, seemed to say that it was accurate, in which they described how Trump took the United States to war. This is in the New York Times. Nobody in the various briefings, at least not according to that article, mentioned this major war, this little conflict in Ukraine, and how drones and precision strike and the battlefield had completely changed. No mention of it. Nothing. And so my point is, no lessons have been learned. I guess that's the recurring theme of this entire program. And so yeah, we're probably going to send them. And the reason is because Trump is being backed into a corner, doesn't have the executive capacity, probably doesn't have the desire, the will, maybe not even the sense of urgency to pull out. So what's he going to do? He's going to send the Marines or send the paratroopers. And my God, that's going to be disastrous. As you know how that's going to go.
Oh yeah.
But yes, we're going to do it. We're going to do it. I don't know if we're going to land in Bandar Abbas or Karg Island. I don't know if we're going to show up on rocket jetpacks. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm quite confident that the senior leadership in the U.S. military is telling the president, hey, send them, send Team America, and let's finish this.
Team America. Fuck yeah. On that note, Cameron, I want to thank you for coming on. Um, it's pretty late over here, so I do need to get a bit of sleep in. Um, it's always a pleasure, and I wish we had some good topics to talk about. Well, we did talk about some positive topics. I'm not going to mention which ones, offline, so that's still in effect, but we can't mention them on here.
Next time we'll talk about the weather. How's that? We'll
The
talk about
weather. It's raining. It's
seasonal
shit.
change in the weather in Moscow, right? So anyway, yes, it's always a pleasure, Saz. Much appreciated. And let's see what happens next.
Oh yeah, and the problem is we're not gonna have to wait long. Any day now. And Ukraine, once Iran fires a missile into Ukraine, and it will, I don't know how the Trump administration is going to react to that. But it's going to be interesting.
Our man Bibi Netanyahu is in CONUS as we speak, and I don't think I need to be a fly on the wall to know what they're discussing. They're discussing resumption of the war,
Yep,
escalation, and that's what they're going to do.
yep, yep. Well, the Goya can go fight for the Zionists.
Yeah,
Sad, sad.
yep.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for joining. One day we'll have some good news stand up. I'm not sure when the hell that day's gonna come, but I'm
It'll
holding out
come.
hope. Yeah.
It'll come. But you got to purge the stupid first, and we'll get to that.
Yeah, but the stupid fight's hard. They
Well,
fight
what
very
one
hard to
one
survive.
quote I will leave your audience with, because it's one of my favorites, but I think there's an important twist to put on it, and that's Einstein said the difference between genius and stupidity is that genius has its limits. Yeah, that's true, but stupidity has a great Twitter account. It's a Twitter follow you gotta make.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Um, and on that note, thank you, folks. We'll talk to you later.